Are we live? Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the valedictory session of the first All India Conference of East Asian Studies, organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, in collaboration with the Department of International Relations and Government Studies, Shiv University. Without further ado, we shall now begin the valedictory session. We're delighted to have amidst us a very eminent speaker, Professor Yeon-chul, former Minister of Unification, Republic of Korea, and Professor at Inje University as the valedictory speaker. Professor Kim is Professor of Unification at Inje University, who served as Minister of Unification under President Moon Jae-in from April 2019 to June 2020. Before being promoted to minister, Professor Kim was the president of the Korea Institute for National Unification, a government-funded research institute. He was previously a policy advisor to the then Minister of Unification, Chung Dong-yong, from 2004 to 2006. After completing his doctorate program, he joined Samsung Economic Research Institute as a senior researcher. He was also the first president of the Humanities Research Institute on Peace Studies. Professor Kim holds 3 degrees in political science from Sun Kyun Kwan University, from a bachelor to a doctorate. We extend a warm welcome to you, Professor. Also joining our esteemed guest in the session are Ambassador Ashok Kantha, Director, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, Colonel Gopal Karunakaran, Executive Director, Shiv University, Dr. Javin Jacob, Co-Convener of the first AICEAS and Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv University. And finally, Dr. Sandip Mishra, Convener of the first AICEAS and Associate Professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. Before I invite the chair to begin the proceedings, I will request all the participants to remain muted throughout the session. I will now invite the chair to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Rija. Let me also extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this valedictory session of the first All India Conference on East Asian Studies. I would like to extend a especially warm welcome to our valedictory speaker, Professor Kim Yeon-chul. As you know, Professor Kim is a distinguished academic who has also been held important positions in the public life of Korea, including as Minister of Unification. We are indeed privileged that he has accepted an invitation and agreed to speak at the concluding session of the inaugural All India Conference of East Asian Studies. The first AICEAS is drawing to a close this evening. As you know, this is the 10th session of the conference. We started yesterday morning with the inaugural session. The Minister Taro Kono delivered a very thoughtful and thought-provoking keynote address. Since then, we had 8 other sessions. And one can say with confidence that discussions at these sessions has been characterized by quality and range of issues that were explored. So it has been, on the whole, a very satisfactory experience for us. Our friends, in a sense, this conference was long overdue. I'm surprised that we didn't have an All India Conference of East Asian Studies earlier. As you know, East Asia is a region of tremendous significance to us, and East Asian studies have made considerable progress in India over the years. As our convener, Dr. Sandip Mishra, mentioned in his remarks yesterday, there's also an Indian way of looking at East Asia, which is different, which is unique in a sense. Therefore, there was a felt need for such a platform which will bring together scholars working on East Asian studies. We conceived this idea last year. I would like to especially thank my colleague, Dr. Sandip Mishra, and also Dr. Javin Jacob, who are convener and co-convener respectively of this conference, for giving shape to the idea and for fleshing it out, for taking it forward. While we were putting together this conference, we are keeping in mind 4 or 5 broad parameters. One, we emphasized the All India character of this new initiative, reached out to various institutions working on East Asia, and we received excellent response. As many as 22 institutions are participating in the first All India Conference of East Asian Studies. I'm sure this number will increase as we hold future editions of the conference. It is meant to be a platform for both established scholars and young scholars to share the ongoing research with fellow scholars and practitioners. As you know, we had 3 curated special panels with invited scholars over the last 2 days. In addition, we had 5 thematic panels based on a call for papers that we issued. And this call for paper received really good response. We had as many as 124 proposals from which we had to select papers for presentation at the conference. 3, we very consciously adopted a multidisciplinary and holistic approach. The scope of the conference covered not only traditional areas like foreign policy, security studies, strategic analysis, and so on, but also history and culture, economy, society, and literature. We wanted to adopt, as I mentioned earlier, a holistic and multidisciplinary approach in our developmental idea of this conference. Moving ahead, we'll continue to pursue such a broad approach. It's our expectation. 4, this is not meant to be a one-off conference. We propose to hold this conference every year in partnership with university or institution interested in East Asian studies. I'm confident that the All India Conference in East Asian Studies will emerge as a flagship event of the Institute of Chinese Studies, much like we have the All India Conference of Chinese Studies, which will have its 15th edition later this year, and India Forum on China, which will have its 5th edition in 2022. We'll continue to focus on the countries of East Asia, including Japan, the Koreas, Mongolia, and Taiwan. There's a suggestion that we should also cover Southeast Asia, at least selectively. We're grateful to have your suggestions in this regard on the scope of the conference moving ahead. Indeed, your feedback will be absolutely invaluable in shaping and fine-tuning this initiative, which we hope will move from strength to strength. Let me put on record once again our deep appreciation for the cooperation received from Shiv Nadar University. I mentioned earlier the important role played by Jabin along with Sandip in putting together this conference. It gives me great pleasure that we have with us this evening Colonel Gopal Karunakaran, Executive Director of Shiv Nadar University, and I'll now invite him to offer his remarks. Over to you, Colonel.
Good evening, everyone here. Firstly, I'd like to begin by saying it's an honor to be at this conference along with my warm welcome to Dr. Kim, Ambassador Kantha. It's a pleasure to be here. My interest in East Asia, because I spent 30 years in the military, of course, is linked to various campaigns. The Korean campaign is one particular campaign I've read in much detail from as a young captain, from what happened at Busan to all the way to Incheon. But it made me think about how countries' cultures can change by a campaign, and how geopolitics and economics and so many cultural influences are there in the way nations shape themselves and their relationship with other countries. But chiefly, my insight into East Asia has come through my twin brother, who spent about 20 years of his life in Korea, in Japan, and in Shanghai. So through him, I've heard a lot about this region, and I look forward to hearing from Professor Kim his address to everybody. And I think on the part of the Shiv Nadar University, I think just not only from the department that we have, but the professors that we have, we're a young university, and we expect to do a bit in shaping India's thinking and policymakers' thinking through the academic lens, and be able to shape it into such a way that East Asia and India come together and closer, not just economically, but in many other ways to make this region a better place to be in. On that note, look forward to hearing Professor Kim. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanil. It gives me great pleasure now to invite Professor Kim to deliver his valedictory address. Professor Kim.
Good evening. It is nice to meet everyone who participated in First All India Conference of East Asian Studies. I worked as the Minister of Unification in Moon Jae-in government. I would like to think about a solution to the North Korean nuclear issue in the world order that has changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since 1972, the Cold War order has maintained stability, not with the US-USSR bipolar system, but at least with the dynamism of the triangular relationship between the US, China, USSR. And after passing the Trump administration and entering the Biden administration, the century of US-China cooperation, that is the Kissinger order, finally came to an end. And the world turned into an era of US-China competition. In recent years, China-Russia relations have developed enough to be called a comprehensive alliance. Putin was able to transfer the military from the Siberian military district to Ukraine based on the stability of Sino-Russian relations, and turned the oil and gas market blocked by sanctions to China. A new Cold War brought about by Sino-Russia cooperation or solidarity between the neighboring authoritarian countries is not desirable for the world order. I hope that Kissinger's perspective on balance of power will be shown at the entrance to chaos. Russia's invasion of Ukraine made North Korea more likely to go its own way. This is because, despite North Korea's further aggravation of the situation, the UN Security Council's joint response has become difficult. North Korea's nuclear capabilities are expanding at this very moment, and the time spent in deadlock has made negotiations even more difficult. North Korea is continuously strengthening its nuclear capabilities. In particular, it is diversifying the types of missile as a means of transport and is preparing to launch satellites recently. The North Korean nuclear negotiations were suspended after a failure of the Hanoi meeting between Kim Jong-un and the US President Donald Trump in February 2019. The Biden administration has since replaced the Trump administration, but the environment for the resumption of negotiations has not improved. The negotiating environment deteriorated further. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, North Korea locked itself away from the outside world, and the Korean Peninsula is gradually turning into a confrontational space as a result of US-China strategic competition. There are still those who argue that negotiations should not be abandoned, but many others argue that South Korea should acknowledge North Korea's possession of nuclear weapons and establish a corresponding deterrent strategy. It is time for a transition in how we perceive the North Korean nuclear issue. I would like to explain the trilemma of North Korean nuclear negotiations. Negotiations over the North Korean nuclear issue have been in a long-term deadlock due to a trilemma. First, to solve the North Korean nuclear problem, US-China cooperation is necessary, but strategic competition between the two countries has intensified. This tension has pushed North Korea and China closer, while North Korea has become passive regarding negotiations with the US. The Biden administration is prioritizing strategic competition with China over North Korean nuclear negotiations. Second, the space for inter-Korean relations has been narrowed because of strong and comprehensive sanctions, even though the role of the two Koreas is crucial to resolving the issue. Structural constraints on inter-Korean relations have weakened South Korea's ability to arbitrate. Third, while we expect a higher degree of denuclearization, it is difficult to speed up the process in the face of deteriorating trust. Negotiations have no choice but to resume from a point of failure. Yongbyon plus alpha is needed to restart negotiations. However, the failure of the Hanoi talks weakened confidences in this option. The pace of denuclearization depends on a level of trust, but the situation seems to have gone into reverse. While holding working level talks on the North Korean nuclear issue is difficult in the first place, coordinating mutual differences once talks to begin requires a considerable amount of time. In order to escape the structural constraints on the North Korean nuclear negotiations, 3 steps are needed. First, define the line between US-China cooperation and US-China strategic competition. Second, strengthen South Korea's arbitrating role by establishing space for inter-Korean relations. And third, speed up the process while building mutual trust. But how do these steps are in reality? First, strategic competition between the US and China is intensified. The area itself expanding and moving to the Korean peninsula. Second, a lack of faith in inter-Korean relations has increased, and the arms race between the North and the South has accelerated. With South Korea's changed the government, inter-Korean relations are more likely to deteriorate further. So as distrust increases, practical consultations have become more difficult. The solution to the North Korean nuclear issue can be divided into 4 categories: deterring, ignoring, managing, and negotiating. As the deadlock is prolonged and North Korean nuclear capabilities advance, the idea of reducing expectations for negotiations and preparing corresponding response strategies has gained traction. The argument now is that South Korea should recognize North Korea as a nuclear state and develop deterrence capabilities with corresponding nuclear weapons. Many Korean politicians are calling for the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons or for nuclear sharing. While it's true that negotiations have become more difficult, it is not time to end them completely. If the role of diplomacy is denied, all that remains is an arms race. Compared to the current state of extended deterrence, the deterrence effect of tactical nuclear weapons is also questionable. More importantly, US-China strategic competition in the military sector has begun in earnest, and strengthening tactical or missile capabilities is likely to worsen South Korea-China relations, regardless of the North Korean nuclear issue. Despite North Korea's strengthening nuclear capabilities, some argue for improving relations and establishing peace. In short, they argue that the nuclear issue should be ignored. However, closing eyes doesn't change reality. Sanctions are in accordance with the UN Security Council resolutions in response to North Korea's nuclear program. South Korea has an obligation to abide by international laws. Without progress in denuclearization, it is difficult to promote peace, including through the development of exchanges and cooperation or the declaration of the end of war. Denuclearization, a peaceful regime, and building an economic community are interconnected. Sanctions must be eased to expand economic cooperation, and denuclearization measures must proceed at the same time. In addition, denuclearization negotiations should be conducted in parallel with a corresponding peace settlement. As negotiations become more difficult, some argue for stable management of the current situation. However, managing the status quo cannot result in stability. If deadlock is prolonged, North Korea's nuclear capabilities will strengthen. There is no justification for maintaining a non-proliferation system at the global level while ignoring the North Korean nuclear issue. The long-term deadlock in the North Korean nuclear negotiations has always led to a worsening status quo rather than a maintenance of it. It is likely to drive the Korean Peninsula to the brink of an arms race compounded by negative interaction with US-China strategic competition. There is still a tendency to think that time is on our side. Regarding the North Korean nuclear situation, the Obama administration's policy of strategic patience turned out to be a misjudgment of the time variables. It's true that sanctions have become more comprehensive and their effect stronger than in the past. However, it's also valid to say that if a humanitarian crisis occurs, the North Korean leadership will not abandon nuclear weapons. The North Korean nuclear negotiations are not among the priorities of the Biden administration. And there is a growing possibility that strategic patience will return, regardless of intentions. It's now time to acknowledge that solving the North Korean nuclear issue won't be achieved in a short period of time. With the failure of the Hanoi summit, the realities surrounding negotiations have become clear. It's important to note that the structural difficulty of negotiations started even before this in January 2018, when North Korea announced completion of nuclear armament prior to sitting down at the negotiating table. After the failure of the Hanoi summit, distrust increased. and the possibility of negotiations further decreased. If it is difficult to make progress on denuclearization, it is also difficult to move forward with a peace settlement and the improvement in inter-Korean relations. Nevertheless, negotiations cannot be abandoned. If North Korea's status as a nuclear power is acknowledged, everything changes. This could result in a dystopic, vicious cycle. The long-term sanction system continues. Traditional deterrent capabilities increase with the enormous defense budget. Insufficient traditional deterrence leads to a specificity in the US nuclear umbrella, triggering US-China strategic competition to intensify into an arms race on the Korean Peninsula, thereby perpetuating the security dilemma. Then how do we move forward? Strategic perception of the situation needs to shift in three ways. First, it is time to transition from a short-term to a long-term approach. The difficult to solve dispute, which has now lasted some 30 years, cannot be solved in a day. Solving the North Korean nuclear issue is a long-term process, and it is difficult to settle negotiations in 1 or 2 sessions. In a literal sense, North Korean nuclear negotiations are not working to cross a mountain, but to cross a mountain range. Another issue is the gap between the public sense of fatigue and the actual state of negotiations. In particular, cynicism and pessimism among the younger generation about inter-Korean relations is concerning. Efforts to respond to public opinion on diplomatic and security policy should be strengthened. Second, there should be a focus on regional strategy rather than just inter-Korean relations. After Korean War, not once have inter-Korean relations operated independently of the East Asian regional order. The 1972 July 4 South-North Korea joint communique, the state of affairs of the basic agreements of North and South between 1991 and 1992, and the 2 inter-Korean summit in the 2000s have all been influenced by changes in East Asian regional affairs. As US-China strategic competition has become more serious, the environment on the Korean Peninsula has changed. If inter-Korean cooperation were maintained through the transition to the new order of competition, the tragedy of geopolitics could have been avoided. However, North Korea tagged along with the new order and chose to move even closer to China. In the era of US-China strategic competition, room for inter-Korea relations will decrease. An environment that enables a solution to the North Korean nuclear issue can occur only if US-China strategic competition does not intensify on the Korean Peninsula. In order to solve the nuclear issue, there should be diplomatic efforts to separate US-China cooperation from strategic competition. Third, the objectives of negotiations should be scaled back. Up to now, negotiations on the nuclear issue stipulated defining denuclearization and all the procedures associated with it before entering the implementation phase. The objective of negotiations was confirmed but never implemented. Then, after deadlock period, renegotiations reconfirmed the same objective, creating a repeated agreement without implementation. The important point is to focus on practical implementation rather than repeatedly reconfirming objectives. Even if some steps are small, any level of implementation will build trust and can progress negotiations to the next stage. While such a step would be difficult today, after some level of trust is established, the purpose can turn to freezing North Korea's nuclear capabilities. Negotiations are a case of give and take, where trust levels determine the speed of implementation. A great transition on the Korean Peninsula and within the East Asian order has begun. The transition is long-term, comprehensive, and structural. Now is the time to face reality and reflect in depth on what comes next. It would be dangerous to take action that might worsen the situation. We must shift our perception to a more long-term approach, breaking away from the familiar but failing strategies of the past. I hope that the conference will contribute to peace on the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim, for those very important remarks you have made about prospects of nuclear negotiations in the Korean Peninsula and various challenges under which these negotiations are progressing. Your comments are frank, insightful, and realistic. You have painted a scenario which is a matter of some concern for all of us, but it's nevertheless based on a very solid assessment of existing trends and realities around us. As Professor Kim pointed out, escalating strategic rivalry between China and the USA has made circumstances more adverse when it comes not only the prospects for nuclear dialogue, but also issues relating to inter-Korean dialogue and the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. Professor Kim has given a number of concrete suggestions on how this matter needs to be addressed. And this is an issue which is of direct interest to India as well, because what happens on Korean Peninsula has a bearing on security and strategic environment of our country also. Thank you very much, Professor Kim, for that very important valedictory address you have just delivered. With your permission, you would like to further disseminate your remarks, give it wider publicity as it deserves. Thanks once again for your remarks. I'll now turn to our next speaker, Dr. Javin Jacob, Associate Professor, Shiv Nadar University, and Co-Convener of the first All India Conference East Asian Studies. As I mentioned earlier, Jabin has played a very important role in putting together this conference. And this evening, he'll be delivering the report on the proceedings of the first conference. Over to you, Jabin.
Thank you, Ambassador Kantha. Professor Kim, Karunakaran, participants of the first AICEAS, colleagues, friends, and my fellow convener, Dr. Sandip Mishra. I have the honor and the rather difficult task of summarizing 2 days worth of discussions in the space of a few minutes. Clear focus and attention in India to countries in East Asia, other than China, has been somewhat lacking in India. I would have said that this is somewhat strange, given India's long historical and civilizational linkages with East Asia, with wider East Asia, to Southeast Asia, to Korea, Japan, Mongolia. But I think it's a fact of life that historical memory fades, it is reimagined and it is rewritten, and not just in India, but elsewhere. And therefore, this ability to forget, or the fact of forgetting, is perhaps not so strange after all. This was a conference that was designed to cover a wide gamut of issues, as is the case with any inaugural or any initiative of this sort. And it had something for everyone, I thought, which was reflected in some very spirited discussions during the course of these 2 days. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a theme that has come up in both the inaugural and the valedictory speeches. We have a clear sense of the pivotal moment, in global politics and global order. While the site of this kinetic action might be on the margins of Europe, its impact potentially will be greater or greatly felt over time in East Asia itself. We began the conference with a no-holds-barred inaugural address by Mr. Taro Kono, the former defense and foreign minister and current sitting member of parliament in the Diet in Japan. He covered a range of issues, talking about dictators holding the veto in the UN Security Council, China's military aggression, to Japan's failure to develop its renewable sector, as well as the promise of India-Japan ties. The first special panel at the conference was on soft power diplomacy. It took a step back to try and pin down the chimera of soft power and its policy effects. And I think no three countries exemplify or meld these two aspects. Soft power and successfully implementing soft power to achieve policy goals as much as South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan do. But high politics, of course, cannot be kept aside for too long. It made a return in the next session with a focus on Mongolia's foreign policy, cross-strait trade relations between China and Taiwan, and China's violations of treaty obligations under UNCLOS in the South China Sea. Two special panels by invited scholars underline the complex mix of politics, security interests, strategic competition, as Professor Kim referred to frequently in his valedictory, and economic interests in East Asia. The first was on transforming strategic order in East Asia, while the second was about India's own interests and engagement with the region, which was, overall titled, a post-RCEP era. Perhaps it's too soon to call this an era. The RCEP is just taking off even as we speak, and its future is still to be settled, or the direction is still to be settled, shall we say, especially since India is not a member. Of course, security issues also came up in many of the panels, but one of the important issues, I think, which speaks to the direction where security or interest in security issues is going in India, I think one key theme was on cybersecurity. It's important that we in India, scholars in India, begin to look at security not just in the conventional sense, but in the multiple new dimensions that technology enables or technology creates complications in. And therefore, I think some of these papers were really interesting. On the economic front, we ranged in topics from digital piracy to, of course, free trade agreements, to the marketization of climate change. There was with a particular focus on South Korea, and Japan's overseas infrastructure development programs. On the social front, I think it was, again, one of the highlights of this conference was its emphasis on social and cultural issues. And we at the AICEAS and the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies together are very proud of the fact that there is a great deal of interest also on these issues alongside the policy aspects of East Asian studies. Clearly, we cannot have one without the other. And on the social front, and the study of social and cultural front, dealing with COVID was, I think, an important theme. I heard the expression virtual kabuki, which I thought was quite interesting. The study of North Korean politics through its propaganda posters, the study of interwar Japanese women, of pop culture, of movie subtitling. I think the sheer range of these topics gives me hope that East Asian studies in India is finding its feet and is confident enough to delve deep and range wide in its study of the region. Both Mr. Kono and Professor Kim refer to transitions in regional and global politics. It would not do for us in India to be behind this curve, behind the curve in understanding these transitions and in managing them. I'd like to think that the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at SNU and the Institute of Chinese Studies have together taken a small step with the first All India Conference on East Asian Studies towards precisely these ends. And on behalf of the ICS and the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at SNU, let me also express the hope that this small step is also the beginning of a collective giant leap towards consolidating the field of East Asian studies in India. Let me thank the participants for their research and the hard work of writing up these papers and making these presentations at this conference. And we hope that the comments and the discussions will help to push you towards eventual publication. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Jabin, for giving us a real flavor of the conference and its proceedings over the last 2 days within a few short minutes. You did a great job. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. We now move to our next speaker, Dr. Sandip Mishra. Sandip, as the convener of the conference, has been playing a stellar role in both conceptualizing the conference and in executing the idea. So Sandip will talk about his role here is to give vote of thanks, but let me once again thank him for his role in putting together the conference. Over to you, Sandip.
Thank you, Mr. Kant. I think it's a collective journey. I think we have started, and now we had 2-day discussion about different themes in East Asia, East Asian studies. We had senior and young scholars debating, discussing about their research interests. It was really interesting. And I would like to admit that it had been quite a good experience. And when we have to evaluate this conference or say subsequent conferences, we ultimately depend on scholarship, which is available. So the more we grow together, the more we are going to make it more rigorous, more you can say much more academically profound conferences. So it's a collective responsibility. I hope that all of us we will strive for that. Now I'll read formal vote of thanks, and I will say that first and foremost, I would like to thank 2 distinguished scholars, distinguished policymakers, and everybody. They are quite famous about their policy, their intervention in policy making. Mr. Taro Kono from Japan and Professor Kim Yeon-chul from Korea. I'm very thankful that they came and they gave their 2 very important lectures. On the behalf of ICS and Shiv Nadar University, I would also like to thank all the chairs. I would name them: Ambassador Deepak Badhwa, Ambassador Skantayal, Professor Saras Soni, Professor Siddharth Malwapuru, Professor Sravani Rai Chaudhary, Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, Professor G. Balata Chandran, Professor Geeta Kini, and Professor Susila Narasimhan. I would also like to thank discussant who had a very difficult job, because in 5 papers, 4 papers, and you have to evaluate them, you have to give your observation and comments in just 10 minutes. So I would like to thank Dr. Samshad Khan, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Dr. Titli Basu, Dr. Tariq Sheikh, Dr. Anushri. Also, I would like to express my gratitude to 3 important people who basically curated 3 special panels where senior scholars, they participated and they showed us, especially to all of us and especially junior scholars, how I think debate and discussions are coordinated and they are being presented to public audience. And I think Dharitri, Venkat, and Jojin, they organized 3 panels. I'm really grateful to them. I'm also grateful to 41 presenters actually presenters, like 41 people who wrote all the papers who are part of this presentation. I'm thankful to all the people who showed interest in our call for papers and they submitted their papers. I'm also thankful to those people, like say, we wrote to several institutions in India to circulate our call for paper, reach out those students, encourage them, and tell them to submit their papers. You can say thankful to them also. Finally, as a convener, on behalf of ICS and Shiv Nadar, these are the formal thanks I wanted to convey. As a convener, I will say that I'm really thankful to my co-convener, Dr. Jabin, all the scholars from associated with ICS, like Mr. Kantha, Professor Srimati Chakravarti, Professor Alka Acharya, Professor Vijanti Raghavan, and Mr. Kishan Rana, and so many people. And the whole team of ICS, like say, especially I would like to name Colonel Venkat Raman, Rija Nair, Rangoli Mitra, Surabhi Mudgali, Shruti Jargar, and so many others who are probably working behind the scene, and we are not able to recognize their role. So I would like to thank all of them because it's a collective journey, and through that, now last but not the least, we are having the Best Paper Award, GPD Award, Govind Deshpande Award, which is being given to best paper presented during these 2 days conference. And that award will be soon announced. And the money will be basically, the financial support will be coming from Professor Ashwini Deshpande and Professor Sudhanova Deshpande, actually. So I think I would like to thank both of them for their support to ICS and our Best Paper Award, this venture. Actually, I'm also, like say, I have given, I would also like to thank all the people who have been last 2 days, very, I think, patiently listening all the papers. And one of them actually is very special. He is Mr. Mumin Shen. So I would like to thank him also, because I think yesterday also, today also, full time he was listening all the presentations. He is a Deputy Chief of Mission from Taiwan in India. So these are the people, and you can say it's a collective, as I told you, that this is a formal vote of thanks. Otherwise, I would like to say that let's walk together, let's make it more rigorous, more academically profound, this journey. And ICS, I hope, under leadership of Mr. Kantha, will always be the key thing, the key institute through which we can coordinate our journey. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandip. So with that vote of thanks, we come to the conclusion of the first All India Conference on East Asian Studies. Before I hand over to Rija, let me also put on record my deep appreciation to my colleagues in ICS, especially Rija, Venkat, Surbhi, Shruti, Rangoli, PR Singh, for kind of work they have put in. They are the real, moving spirits behind the success of this conference. I thank them. Back to you, Rija.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind words. Before we draw the session to an end, I would like to thank Professor Yeon-chul and all the panelists for joining us for the valedictory session, as well as our audience on Zoom and YouTube who have stayed through with us through both the days of the conference. Last but not the least, on behalf of ICS, I would like to extend our gratitude to the SNU team for all their support. The video recordings of all our sessions are available on the ICS YouTube channel. The link has been shared in the chat box. We hope to build upon the support and encouragement we have received for this conference and look forward to your continued support and participation in the next chapter of AICEAS. Thank you everyone for logging in. Have a good evening.